What do you do when the most peaceful people in the galaxy run out of peaceful options? You call the one species everyone else is afraid of. For 217 years, the Thari Dominion had been dying by degrees. It did not feel like dying at first. It felt like loss after loss, each one survivable, each one explainable. A colony here, a research outpost there, a fleet that simply never reported in. The Thari were a species built on harmony. They had abolished war among themselves 9,000 years ago, built cities that breathed with their inhabitants, and raised children who had never once seen a weapon fired in anger. Then the swarm came. No one knew where they originated. No one had ever negotiated with them, because the swarm did not negotiate. It consumed. World after world fell silent under black holes that moved like a single organism, stripping planets of resources and leaving nothing but dust and silence behind. The Thari fought with everything their gentle civilization could muster. Diplomacy turned to desperation. Defense turned to retreat. Retreat turned to extinction math that no one wanted to do out loud. High Speaker Ilara Voss stood in the Sanctum of Tides, the last great council chamber of the Dominion, watching a holographic display of the galaxy slowly going dark, world by world, like a candle being smothered under glass. "Status," she said quietly. "The outer 30 systems are gone," said Counselor Ben, his voice hollow. "Sector Command estimates we have 8 years before the swarm reaches a Dominion core. Maybe less. 8 years. 200 years of dying. And now a countdown anyone could read on their fingers. There is one option remaining," said a younger voice, strategist Io Ren, barely 30 cycles old, the only person in the chamber who had grown up entirely in wartime. "It is not a comfortable one." "Say it," Ilara said. "Humanity." The word landed like a drop weapon. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Not surprise, but a kind of old, inherited dread. Every species in known space had heard of humanity, a species barely 400 years into starflight, and already infamous, not for their technology, though it was formidable, not for their numbers, though they bred and built with frightening speed. They were infamous for one simple, terrifying truth. They had never lost a war they decided to finish. "They are violent," Counselor Ben said. "Aggressive. They have fought each other for 10,000 years before they ever left their homeworld. We have read the histories. We know what they are. We know what they were," Io said. "We don't know what they've become. And right now, Counselor, I would rather stand beside a monster than die a peaceful death in 8 years." Ilara closed her eyes. The Thari had prided themselves on never needing violence, on solving every problem with patience and wisdom. It had taken 2 centuries and the slow extinction of her people to teach her that patience and wisdom meant nothing to something that simply wanted to eat the universe. "Draft a message," she said. "Send it to the human homeworld. Tell them everything. Tell them we are dying, and we are asking, not for weapons, not for soldiers, but for hope. Tell them we have nothing left to offer but gratitude." The message took 11 days to reach Seoul. It was the most honest, most desperate, most carefully worded plea the Thari had ever composed. Pages of context, pleading, statistics on swarm advancement, projected extinction timelines, an entire civilization's dignity laid bare on a single transmission. The response came 4 hours later. 3 words. "We are coming." The Sanctum of Tides went utterly silent. Ilara stared at the words for a long moment, waiting for elaboration that never came. No terms. No questions about what was needed, what resources would help, what timeline made sense. No request for further information at all. "That's it," Counselor Ben finally said. "No fleet manifest? No questions about troop requirements, logistics, supply lines? They didn't even ask how many ships we need. They didn't ask," Io said slowly, something unreadable in her voice, "because they already decided. They're not asking what we need. They've already decided what they're bringing." 9 days later, the Dominion's outer sensor net lit up with contacts. Not a relief convoy. Not a diplomatic envoy testing the waters with a handful of cautious ships. 412 vessels dropped out of slip space in perfect formation above the Thari capital world. Their hulls dark and purposeful. Weapons arrays already active. Engines humming with restrained violence. At the head of the formation, a single command ship broadcast an opening hail that needed no translation software to feel its weight. This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Chun of the Seoul Defense Coalition, commanding the Joint Expeditionary Force Wrath of Dawn. The voice said, calm and absolutely certain. We receive your message. We're here to end this. Illyra stood at the viewport of the sanctum, watching human warships fill the sky above her dying homeworld, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in decades. Terror, yes, but underneath it, for the first time in 2 centuries, something that felt dangerously close to hope. What the Thari expected was a rescue. What arrived instead was a reckoning. And the swarm, for the first time in its long and terrible existence, was about to discover what it felt like to be hunted. 200 years of careful defense had taught the Thari how to survive. For hours of human strategy session were about to teach them how to win, and the cost of that lesson would terrify everyone watching. Admiral Marcus Chun did not waste time on pleasantries. Within an hour of landing on Thari soil, he had commandeered the sanctum of Tide's largest data chamber, and within 3 hours his staff, a tight, weathered group of officers, engineers, and one unervingly young intelligence analyst named Priya Konkore, had devoured 2 centuries of Thari combat records, sensor logs, casualty reports, and swarm behavioral data. Illyra watched from the chamber's edge, equal parts fascinated and unsettled. They don't analyze like we do, Io murmured beside her. We study to understand. They study to exploit. It was, Illyra realized, exactly right. Thari military scholars had spent 200 years documenting the swarm of the patient, almost academic thoroughness of a species trying to comprehend an incomprehensible threat. Humans looked at the same data and asked one question, over and over. Where does it break? Here, Priya said, freezing a swarm engagement record on the main display. The catastrophic loss of the Thari Third Fleet 81 years prior. Every single engagement we've reviewed shows the same pattern. The swarm doesn't coordinate through individual ship intelligence. It's a hive mind relay system. See, the synchronized vector shifts half a second before any individual unit could have reacted independently. They're slave to a central cognition node. We know this, Counselor Ben said stiffly. It's why we've never been able to decapitate their command structure. The relay nodes shift position constantly. Untraceable. Untraceable to your sensor arrays, Admiral Chin said, not unkindly. Not untraceable, period. He nodded to Priya, who pulled up a secondary chart. Gravitic distortion patterns layered against the swarm's known engagement zones. Every relay shift produces a gravitic signature. Tiny. Your scanners weren't built to catch it, because your scanners were built to keep your people safe at a distance. Ours were built to find things that don't want to be found. Illyra felt a chill. You can track their command nodes. We can predict them, Chin said, which is better. We don't need to find where the brain is right now. We need to know where it's going to be. Over the following days, the sanctum transformed. Thari engineers, brilliant, careful, methodical people who had spent careers perfecting defensive shield technology, found themselves working alongside human counterparts who treated every problem like a puzzle with a violent solution hiding inside it. This shield lattice is beautiful, said Chief Engineer Dario Ibarra, examining a Thari defensive grid schematic with genuine admiration. It's also completely wrong for what we're about to do. Wrong how? The lead Thari engineer, Sale Corvin, asked, more curious and offended. It's built to absorb hits indefinitely. Defensive doctrine, outlast enemy. But we're not planning to outlast anything. We're planning to be somewhere else by the time the swarm figures out where we went. Dario sketched rapidly on a holographic slate. Reroute 60% of your shield capacitor reserve into short burst slip space micro jumps. You lose sustained defense. You gain the ability to not be where the attack lands. Sale stared at the schematic for a long moment. This is reckless. If the calculations are off by even a fraction, then we're dead, Dario agreed cheerfully. Which is also what happens if we keep doing it your way, just slower and with more crying. It should have been offensive. Instead, Sale found himself laughing for the first time in longer than he could remember. This was the pattern. Again and again, human strategists didn't dismiss 2 centuries of Thari knowledge. They devoured it, respected it, and then immediately began breaking apart to find the aggressive edges hiding inside cautious designs. Within 5 days, weapons no Thari engineer would have dared propose were being assembled in orbital foundries. Micro-jump strike craft, gravitic disruption mines designed to scramble swarm relay signatures, modified Thari shield technology repurposed into kinetic ram, plating for ships meant to hit hard and vanish before retaliation arrived. "You're not just fighting differently than us," Ilara said to Admiral Chun, during a rare quiet moment on the Sanctum's observation deck, watching the assembled human Thari fleet drilling in the system's outer dark. "You're thinking differently. We spent 2 centuries trying to survive the swarm. You've spent 5 days trying to murder it." Chin was quiet for a moment, watching the ships move in formation below. Human warships and newly retrofitted Thari vessels, flying together for the first time in history. "Can I tell you something, High Speaker?" he said. "Humanity didn't get good at war because we wanted to be. We got good at it because for most of our history, somebody was always trying to kill us, and the only species more relentless than the thing trying to kill you has to be you." He looked at her directly. "You spent 200 years being brave in a way I genuinely respect, defending, protecting, refusing to become something cruel just to survive. That took a kind of courage we don't have much practice with, but surviving and winning are different games. We're here to make sure you don't have to choose between staying who you are and staying alive." Below them, the fleet completed its final drill formation, 412 human warships, and now 60 retrofitted Thari vessels alongside them, moving as one. "Admiral," Ilara said quietly, "when do we move against the swarm's heart?" Chen's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. 41 hours. Long enough to finish the math. Not long enough for them to see us coming. 200 years of defense had taught the Thari how to survive a war they couldn't win. 5 days with humanity had taught them something far more dangerous, how it felt to finally believe they could end it. No one had ever gone looking for the swarm's heart before. The Thari had spent 2 centuries simply trying to survive its reach. Humanity was about to do the unthinkable, go hunting. The swarm's home territory had no name, because no Thari scout had ever returned from it to give it one. It sat at the galaxy's ragged edge, a region the old star chart simply marked with a warning glyph and a blank space, a graveyard of dead systems stripped to bare rock, stitched together by slip-space corridors thick with wreckage from 2 centuries of one-sided slaughter. No fleet had ever entered that dark and come back with useful intelligence. Most hadn't come back at all. 472 ships went in anyway. Final positions confirmed. Priya's voice came calm over command channel aboard the Wrath of Dawn, though Ilara, strapped into an observer's chair on the bridge, against every instinct that told her a high speaker belonged in a council chamber, not a warship, could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. Relay node prediction model holds at 91% confidence. If it's wrong, we're flying into the deepest part of their territory on a guess. "It's not a guess," Admiral Chin said, eyes on the tactical display. "It's math with consequences. Helm, take us in." The fleet dropped from slip space into a system the charts had never bothered to name, and for one suspended second, nothing happened at all. Then the void around them simply began to move, black against black, a horizon-spanning mass of swarm vessels uncoiling from where they'd been hidden, sense of dark, waiting. "Contact," the tactical officer said, voice tight. "Multiple contacts. Gods, it's the whole hive." "Numbers," Chin said. "Conservative estimate, 11,000 vessels. Could be more." Ilara's stomach dropped. Even with 472 of the most advanced warships humanity could field, the math was monstrous. 11,000 to 472. The Thari had fought battles at far better odds and still lost entire fleets in hours. But Chin didn't flinch, and neither did the fleet. "Strike wings. Execute pattern hollow needle. Disruption mines on my mark. Remember, we are not here to win a battle of attrition. We are here to cut the head off and leave before the body finishes dying." What followed was unlike anything in 200 years of Thari military history. The human fleet didn't form a wall to meet the swarm's advance. It dissolved, splintering into dozens of fast strike groups, each one weaving to the swarm's leading edge using the same micro-jump technology Dario Ibarra had sketched on a slate 5 days earlier, appearing for seconds at a time, only long enough to fire precision strikes before vanishing into another jump. Gravitic disruption mines bloomed silently across the swarm formation, scrambling to relay signatures that should have let every swarm vessel move as one. For the first time in recorded history, sections of Swarm Hive began moving independently, confused, uncoordinated, vulnerable. "It's working," Sail Corvin breathed, watching from a retrofitted Thari command vessel fly in the fleet's second wave. 200 years, and we never even tried this. 200 years. You were fighting to live another day, Io said beside him, watching the same display with fierce, wide-eyed focus. They're fighting to make sure there isn't another day for them. The relay no prediction held. Deep in the heart of confused, fragmenting swarm formation, a single massive structure became visible on long-range sensors. Vast, dark, organic-looking despite its impossible size, pulsing faintly with the same gravitic signature the human analysts had been tracking for 5 days. "That's it," Priya said, voice taut with something between triumph and disbelief. "That's the central cognition node. Admiral, we have a clean vector." "Then we take it," Chin said. "All strike wings. Converge on the primary target. Thari vessels, hold the disruption perimeter. Keep that hive blind while we go in." It was Sail who answered, his voice steady despite 200 years of caution screaming against everything he was about to say. "Confirmed, Admiral. The Dominion fleet holds a line." What followed was 11 minutes that would be studied, replayed, and mythologized for generations. Human strike craft burning through a fragmenting wall of swarm vessels, Thari ships holding a defensive perimeter unlike anything they'd ever attempted, both fleets bleeding losses that made Illyra's chest ache with every flashing red icon on the tactical display, until finally the wrath of dawn itself, Admiral Chen's own command ship, broke through the last offensive ring and brought its entire forward weapons array to bear on the pulsing, ancient structure at the heart of the swarm. "Fire," Chen said. The cognition node didn't explode so much as it unraveled. A vast, silent collapse of light and structure, and across the entire battle space, 11,000 swarm vessels went still all at once, like a puppet whose strings had all been cut simultaneously. The silence that followed was the strangest sound Illyra had ever heard. "Confirm kill," Chin said quietly, and Illyra could hear, beneath the professional calm, something that sounded almost like disbelief at his own success. "Confirm the kill, somebody please, before I believe it." "Confirmed," Priya said, and her voice cracked on a word. "Central cognition node destroyed. Swarm fleet it's just drifting, Admiral. They're not moving. They're not doing anything." On the bridge of the Wrath of Dawn, for 100 years of human warfare and 200 years of Thari suffering arrived together at the same impossible moment. A war that seemed unwinnable was, by every measure available to them, over. Illyra found she could not speak. 2 centuries of grief, of loss, of careful diplomatic language designed to avoid ever naming the despair underneath it, and none of it had prepared her for what victory actually felt like. Humanity had done in 11 minutes what the Thari had failed to do in 200 years. But somewhere in the wreckage of the swarm's broken hive mind, a far older intelligence had felt its puppet die, and was already waking up. The swarm was dead. The war was over. The celebration lasted exactly 6 hours, and then the galaxy learned the most terrifying lesson of all. Sometimes the monster you finally kill was never the real monster at all. The return of Thari space felt, for the first time in 200 years, like coming home rather than retreating. Illyra stood in the sanctum of tides as reports flooded in from across the Dominion. Swarm vessels across dozens of systems, their central coordination severed, drifting derelict or shutting down entirely without the cognition node to direct them. Colonies that had braced for annihilation watched their skies clear instead. Children who had been born into bomb shelters stepped outside under open sky for the first time in their lives. "Casualty report," Illyra said, though she dreaded the answer. "Severe," Io said quietly, reading from a data slate, her earlier triumph tempered now by the weight of numbers. "We lost 11 Thari vessels and over 4,000 crew. The human fleet loss." She paused. Admiral Chen's forces took losses too. 63 ships, nearly 9,000 human personnel. The number landed heavily. 9,000. People who had answered a 3-word message from strangers and died light years from the homes that had sent them, fighting a war that had never been theirs to begin with. They didn't have to come, Illyra said, almost to herself. They had no treaty with us, no history, no reason beyond the fact that we asked. I asked Admiral Chin about that. Io said, before we left the swarm system. I asked him why humanity does this. Why a species famous across the galaxy for its violence keeps spending its sons and daughters on wars that aren't its own. What did he say? He said that humanity spent most of its history being the thing other people feared, and it took him a long time to realize that being strong only meant something if you used that strength for someone besides yourself. He said, Io's voice caught slightly. He said the scariest thing in the galaxy isn't a species willing to fight. It's a species willing to fight for free. 6 hours of cautious celebration followed. The first real celebration the Sanctum of Tides had hosted in 2 centuries. Thari and human crews mingled in makeshift gatherings across the fleet, exchanging stories, sharing food, the strange, easy camaraderie of people who had bled side by side and survived it. It lasted exactly until Priya Conquerors burst into the Sanctum's command chamber, her face the color of old ash. Admiral, High Speaker, you need to see this. Right now. The display she brought up showed long-range sensor data from the system where the swarm's cognition node had died, and at the center of it, something that should not have existed. A structure was rising from a void where the cognition node's wreckage had drifted dormant for 6 hours. It was vast beyond anything the combined fleet had encountered. Easily 10 times the size of the destroyed cognition node, its architecture unlike swarm biology entirely. Geometric, ancient, scarred with a patina of unimaginable age. That's not swarm, Sale said, staring. That's nothing like swarm construction. Where did it come from? It didn't come from anywhere, Priya said. Our sensor logs show it was there the entire time, buried beneath the cognition node, dormant. We killed the swarm's brain, and apparently that was enough to wake up whatever's underneath it. The structure began to broadcast, not on any military frequency, but on every frequency simultaneously, an act of casual, overwhelming power that made Illyra's skin crawl. The voice that came through was not a voice so much as an impression, ancient and patient and utterly without malice, which somehow made it more terrifying than rage would have been. You have destroyed our instrument, it said. 12,000 years of careful equilibrium, undone by impatient children playing with weapons they do not understand. Identify yourself, Admiral Chin said, his voice carrying across every channel even as his hands moved rapidly across the tactical console, already preparing for the worst. We are the architects. We built the swarm, as we have built a dozen instruments before it. Across 100,000 years of careful stewardship, did you imagine your galaxy's peace was an accident? Every war we permitted because it taught a lesson. Every civilization we allowed to nearly die, we allowed because the survivors learned humility. Fear is the only language that keeps young species from destroying everything around them before they are wise enough to deserve power. The swarm was never your enemy. It was your teacher. The chamber went utterly silent. You're telling us, Illyra said slowly, horror rising in her chest like floodwater, that 200 years of genocide, billions of my people dead, was a lesson? A correction, the voice replied, with what might have been something like regret, if regret could exist without remorse. Your civilization grew complacent in its peace. It needed reminding of consequence. We are sorry for the children who suffered. We are not sorry for the lesson they will carry forward. What would have remained of you in another 1,000 years of safety and softness? And humanity? Chin said, his voice flat and dangerous in a way Lara hadn't heard from before. What lesson did you plan for us? A pause, the first hesitation the ancient voice had shown. Humanity was not meant to be part of this equation. You were not invited into this war. Your presence here is an irregularity we did not account for, and now you have destroyed an instrument 12,000 years in the making. Something in the tone shifted, hardened. This cannot go unanswered. The equilibrium must be restored. If the swarm cannot teach the lesson, then we will teach it ourselves, to every species who dare to imagine this war was theirs to win. across the long-range sensors. More shapes began to emerge from behind the awakening structure. Vast, ancient warships, more advanced than anything combined fleet had encountered, more numerous than the swarm's broken armada had ever been. "Admiral," Priya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm reading thousands of contacts. They're not swarm. They're something else entirely. Something that's been hiding behind the swarm this whole time. Admiral, what do we do?" Ilera turned to Admiral Chun. 200 years of careful diplomatic composure, finally cracking under the weight of what was coming. "Admiral, what do we do?" Chun looked at the screen for a long moment. At the ancient fleet awakening from millennia of dormancy, at the casualty reports still scrolling from the battle they'd barely survived, at the exhausted, victorious crews who had been celebrating 6 hours earlier and were now staring down an enemy infinitely worse than the one they'd just destroyed. "We do what we came here to do," he said quietly. "We finish it." The swarm had never been the true enemy, only a leash held by something far older, far colder, and far more powerful. And as ancient warships filled the void where celebration had been moments before, humanity and the Thari realized the war they thought they'd won had only just truly begun. An enemy 12,000 years in the making had just woken up, and it didn't see humanity and the Thari as opponents worth fighting. It saw them as children who needed punishing. That mistake was about to cost the architects everything. "Send word to every allied system within range," Admiral Chin said, his voice carrying across the bridge of the Wrath of Dawn with steadiness that Ilera found she desperately needed in that moment. "Tell them what's coming. Tell them to prepare. And tell Earth Command we need every reserve fleet they can spare, now, no exceptions." "Admiral, the nearest reserve fleet is 11 days out," the communications officer said, "even at maximum slip space burn. Then we have to survive 11 days, Chin said. On the tactical display, the Architect fleet was finishing its emergence. Not thousands of ships, Priya's revised count confirmed, but closer to 6,000, each one dwarfing even the largest human or Thari vessel, their hulls marked with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange when looked at too directly, as if the ships themselves existed slightly outside normal space. Their weapon signatures don't match anything in our databases. Dario Ibarra reported from engineering, voice tight. "I'm reading energy outputs that shouldn't be physically possible with conventional reactor technology. Whatever's powering those ships, it's not anything we understand." "Then we make them explain it to us the hard way," Chin said, though even his confidence carried a thread of grim calculation rather than certainty. Ilera found Sale Corvin and Io Ren at a side console, both staring at the Architect fleet with particular horror of people who had spent 2 centuries believing they understood the shape of their suffering, only to learn the truth was so much larger and crueler than they'd imagined. 200 years, Sale said hollowly. 200 years of grief, and it was a lesson, like we were children being punished for growing too comfortable. "They're wrong," Io said, fierce despite the fear in her eyes. "Whatever they think they're doing, controlling the galaxy through manufactured fear, it's not wisdom. It's tyranny wearing the mask of teaching." "Tell that to the warships," Sale muttered. "I intend to," Io said, and something in her voice made Ilera look at her properly for the first time since the battle began. The same fire that had first suggested calling humanity now burning brighter, sharper, refusing to be extinguished by the impossible scale of what faced them. The Architect fleet's first attack came without warning or ceremony. A single beam of condensed energy lancing from the nearest vessel and vaporizing of Thari frigate at the fleet's edge before any defensive system could even register the threat as incoming. "That's one ship," Chin said grimly, watching the tactical display. "One ship did that. All strike wings, scatter formation. Do not engage head-on, repeat, do not engage head-on. We cannot win this through firepower." "Then how do we win it?" Sale said over the open channel, fear and determination mixing in his voice in a way no Thari military officer would have permitted himself 2 centuries ago. "The same way we won the last one," Chin said. "We find where it breaks." It took 2 desperate, costly hours of skirmishing, of strike craft darting in and out of the Architect fleet's reach, of human pilots making jumps so precise they left no margin for error in Thari gunners, civilians barely a week removed from peacetime lives, learning to fire weapons they'd never trained to use, before Priya found something in the chaos of sensor data that made her sit up sharply. Admiral, the architect ships, they're old, genuinely ancient, not just in design philosophy. Their reaction times to our micro-jump strikes are getting slower. Not by much, but it's measurable. I think they've spent 12,000 years controlling things from a distance, manipulating through proxies like the Swarm. They haven't fought a real war themselves in longer than that. You're saying they're rusty, Chin said. I'm saying they're a god that's never had to actually bleed, Priya said. And gods that have never bled don't know how to handle pain when it finally arrives. Chen's expression shifted. The first real flicker of something like hope since the architect fleet had emerged. Then let's introduce them to it personally. Concentrate every strike wing on isolating individual vessels. Don't engage the fleet as a whole. Peel off single ships and overwhelm them before reinforcements arrive. Thari gunships. Use your disruption mine technology on their shield arrays. Same principle as the Swarm relay jamming, different target. What followed was a brutal, grinding battle of attrition unlike the swift surgical strike that had ended the Swarm War. The Architect fleet, for all its overwhelming power, fighting with the stiff unfamiliarity of a force that had genuinely forgotten what it meant to face an enemy that refused to simply be afraid. Ship by ship, the combined human Thari fleet picked apart isolated Architect vessels through sheer audacity and the willingness to take losses that should have been unthinkable. But the numbers were still catastrophic. By the 6th hour, the combined fleet had lost over 140 vessels. The Wrath of Dawn itself had taken 3 direct hits, its hull groaning under stress no human ship had ever been designed to survive, fires burning in 4 separate sections that emergency crews fought even as the battle raged on outside. Admiral, we cannot sustain this rate of loss, the tactical officer said, voice strained. At current attrition, we lose total combat effectiveness within 9 hours. The reserve fleet won't arrive for another 5 days at minimum. Chin looked at the display, at the Architect fleet, wounded but still vastly numerous, at his own battered ships still fighting, at the Thari vessels flying formations that 2 centuries of pure defense had never prepared them to fly. He turned to Ilera, standing at the edge of the bridge, 200 years of her civilization's grief and 4 centuries of human violence converging in the same desperate moment. High Speaker, he said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Ask, Ilera said. Your people have spent 2 centuries refusing to become something cruel just to survive. I respect that more than I can say. But I need to know. If I ask the Thari to fight not just beside us, but to fight as hard as we do, no holding back, no caution, everything you have, every ship, every soul willing to volunteer, will they answer? Ilera thought of Sale's voice cracking with fear and determination both. Of Io's fire, refusing to be extinguished. Of 200 years of children growing up in bomb shelters, finally stepping into open sky, only to watch the sky fill with something worse. Admiral, she said, we already have. The architects had spent 12,000 years believing fear was the only language that mattered, that civilizations needed punishment to stay humble, that peace required a leash. They had never once imagined that the very act of finally fighting back would be the lesson that broke them. 12,000 years of manufactured fear were about to be answered by something the architects had never accounted for. Not the desperate defense of the dying, but the unbreakable resolve of the willing. This was the final stand that would decide the fate of the galaxy. The Thari answer came not as a single fleet, but as a flood. Within hours of Ilera's call, every shipyard across the Dominion's surviving core worlds began launching whatever to fly. Military vessels still under repair, civilian transports hastily retrofitted with whatever weapons could be mounted. Even ancient ceremonial cruisers pulled from museum orbit and armed for the first time in centuries. Volunteers who had never held a weapon in their lives stepped forward to crew them, driven by something that 200 years of careful pacifism had never quite managed to extinguish. The simple, fierce refusal to watch their children inherit a galaxy ruled by fear. 800 additional vessels, Priya reported, disbelief coloring her voice as the reinforcement numbers climbed across her display. Admiral, the Thari just fielded more ships in 6 hours than they've assembled in the last 50 years combined. Give me your command again, Chin said. Tell them the timeline just changed. Tell them if they can get anything here faster than 5 days, now's the time. The answer that came back 20 minutes later was not from Earth Command at all. It was a single, massive contact dropping out of slip space at the system's edge, and then another and another, until the sensor display showed an entire reserve fleet arriving not in 5 days, but in hours, having been quietly redirected the moment the first reports of the Architect awakening reached Seoul. Admiral Chun. Came a new voice over command channel, weathered and familiar. Fleet Admiral Dianose, Seoul Strategic Reserve. We heard you might need a hand. You were already moving before I called, Chin said, something like relief breaking through his exhaustion. We've been tracking Thari distress signals since the moment you left Seoul. Osei said, figured you might find more than you bargained for out here. We didn't wait for permission. Sending you our full manifest now. 340 vessels, fresh and fully armed. The combined fleet that gathered in the system's heart in the hours that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Battered human warships standing alongside fresh reserves, Thari military vessels flying beside repurposed civilian transports, and ancient cruisers crewed by volunteers who had never fired a weapon before that week, all arrayed against an Architect fleet that, despite its overwhelming power, had spent 12,000 years forgetting what it meant to face, something that refused to be afraid. Ilera stood on the bridge of the Wrath of Dawn, watching the formation assemble, and found Io Ren beside her, dressed now in a hastily fitted void suit, having volunteered to crew one of the retrofitted civilian transports. You don't have to do this, Ilera said. Neither did they, Io said, nodding toward the human ships beyond the viewport. 3 words. We are coming. They didn't ask what was in it for them. They didn't calculate the odds first. They just came. She looked at Ilera, eyes bright with something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but some fierce combination of both. 200 years. High Speaker, we told ourselves that staying gentle meant staying small. That courage and peace couldn't exist in the same person. They just proved that's a lie. I want to prove it too. The Architect voice returned across every channel as the combined fleet moved into formation, its ancient patience finally showing the first cracks of something like genuine surprise. This is irrational, it said. You cannot win this engagement. Your reinforcements change nothing. We have governed the balance of this galaxy for 12,000 years through wisdom you cannot comprehend. Funny thing about wisdom, Admiral Chin said, broadcasting back across every frequency the Architects were using, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had already decided this battle was won, regardless of what the numbers said. It's supposed to make you humble. You sound like you forgot what that word means a long time ago. The final battle lasted 9 hours. It was not a clean, surgical strike, like the death of the swarm's cognition node. It was brutal and grinding and cost more than anyone in the combined fleet would ever fully reckon with. Human ships destroyed in their dozens, Thari volunteer crews who had been civilians a week earlier giving everything they had and more, Sail Corbin's own vessel taking a crippling hit that left him fighting fires in the dark for 3 hours before reinforcements could reach him. But ship by ship, system by system, the Architect fleet's ancient, rusted confidence cracked further with every hour that the combined human-Thari force refused to break, refused to retreat, refused to be the frightened, obedient galaxy the Architects had spent 12,000 years cultivating. It ended when Io Ren's retrofitted transport, one of dozens of small, fast Thari vessels weaving disruption mines to the Architect formation under Dario Ibar's modified tactics, found and disabled the Central Command vessel's shield generator in a maneuver so reckless that Admiral Chin later admitted he'd never have ordered it himself. Command vessel shields down. Priya's voice rang across the channel, pure triumph cutting through 9 hours of exhaustion. All wings, concentrate fire, now, now, now. The Architect command vessel, 12,000 years of accumulated power and certainty, broke apart under a concentrated barrage from human and Thari weapons fired side by side, and across the battle space, the remaining Architect fleet, without central coordination, without the absolute certainty that had defined its existence for longer than most civilizations had existed at all, began for the first time to retreat. The Architect's final transmission, broadcast as their surviving vessels withdrew into dark, carried none of its earlier ancient patience. It carried something that, for an intelligence 12,000 years old, might have been the very first lesson it had ever truly learned. "We do not understand," it said. "You should have been afraid. Fear is the only thing that has ever kept young species from destroying everything around them." It was Ilera who answered, stepping to the open channel before Admiral Chun could speak. 200 years of grief and courage finally finding the words she had needed for a lifetime. "We were afraid," she said. "For 200 years, we were the most afraid civilization in this galaxy. Fear never taught us anything except how to keep dying quietly. What changed everything wasn't the absence of fear. It was finding someone willing to be afraid with us, instead of leaving us alone to face it." She looked at the wreckage of the Architect Command vessel, at the battered, victorious fleet around her, human and Thari ships flying in formation that no one would believe possible 2 weeks earlier. "You wanted to teach the galaxy that strength requires control. We just taught you that the only thing stronger than control is choosing, freely, to stand beside someone who needs you. You should be very afraid of that lesson. We intend to teach it again." The Architect fleet did not answer. It simply withdrew into the dark from which it had come. 12,000 years of careful tyranny finally, irrevocably broken. In the weeks that followed, as the combined fleet returned to Thari space to bury its dead and begin the long, uncertain work of rebuilding, a new alliance was forged that would outlast both the war that created it and the species that fought it. Not a treaty built on fear or obligation, but something the galaxy had rarely seen before, an alliance built on the simple, unbreakable proof that when one civilization called for help in its darkest hour, another had answered without hesitation, without condition, and without ever once asking what was in it for them. Admiral Marcus Chun stood beside High Speaker Ilera Voss at the dedication of a memorial built jointly by human and Thari hands, listing names from both species side by side, a single inscription carved above them in both languages. "We are coming." 3 words. Ilera said quietly, reading them for what felt like the 1,000th time. "You changed the fate of the galaxy with 3 words." "No," Chin said, looking out at the gathered crowd, humans and Thari standing together, grieving together, beginning to heal together. 3 words got us here. Everyone standing in this crowd is what actually changed the galaxy. He looked at her, something quietly proud in his weathered face. "Including you, High Speaker. Including every Thari who decided that staying gentle didn't mean staying small. Far beyond the edges of charted space, in the dark places the architects had retreated to, something ancient and wounded began slowly to reconsider 12,000 years of certainty. But for the first time in 200 years, the galaxy did not wait to find out what came next in fear. It waited together, unafraid and ready.